Okay, here we are. Just that. Looks a little bit better. So yeah, this is going to be part 2 of the reasons why I am becoming Catholic and seeking confirmation in the Catholic Church. So last time I need to make an apology for something that went on in the last video after watching it, which is that after watching it, I got the impression that I was believing that I was somehow the one responsible for my conversion to the Catholic faith, when obviously I'm only partly responsible for that. And so I want to try to avoid that kind of pride in the future. And I just don't want to think of myself as a person who, oh yeah, it's because of my great intellect and wisdom that I became a Catholic. Wisdom and virtue. I mean, sure. I mean, part of it's because of wisdom, virtue, and that I became a Catholic, right? I mean, obviously, if you make a choice, you're going to be involved in that choice. However, I also have to recognize that I almost certainly wouldn't be a Catholic today if there wasn't grace involved. Not almost certainly wouldn't be a Catholic if there was no grace involved. So I just want to get that out of the way and say that, so it's not just because of me, right? It's because of grace of everyone who came before me, the grace of people praying for me, the grace that flowed down in ways I probably don't even know, things that happened to me that I don't even know about, that were only there because of God's grace, right? So, and again, Catholics, we're not Calvinists, and we're not, can't remember I want to say Arian, but I know it's not, what the opposite of Calvinism is, right? Where it's like, we believe in both the predestination and free will at the same time. Again, not a theologian, so don't take me at my word on that one, but as far as I understand. Okay, so that out of the way, let's continue on where we left off last time, which was on the topic of tithing. Okay, so I'd mentioned last time, I kind of just briefly summarized the tithing thing, but I want to get into it a little bit more so that people aren't confused about that. Again, if you go into the Bible and the Christian understanding of interpretation of the Bible, this is not just Catholics, Orthodox, or Protestant, or Catholics or Orthodox that believe this. This is like most Christian sects understand this about Christianity, which is that there's a differentiation between the old Mosaic law and the New Testament covenant, right? So that's not to say that everything in the old Mosaic law is not included. It's that there's this thing called, let's say, the ceremonial laws, things like circumcision, which were ceremonial laws that were put in place for the Jews and not later on for the Gentiles, once Christ came for the Gentiles. And it's very easy to sort of understand which ones belong where. I wouldn't say it's very easy, but it's not that complicated. The moral laws are laws that are fairly obvious laws, and the ceremonial laws are laws that you're like, well, why wouldn't they be allowed to wear mixed fabrics? If you're asking that, why wouldn't they be allowed to do that? There's a good likelihood that it's a ceremonial law. But again, that's a thing on tithing, right? What I understood from reading the Bible is that tithing was one of the ceremonial laws. Tithing 10% of your income was actually a ceremonial law. And that what they preached in Protestant churches, or all of the Protestant churches I had been to, was that it wasn't a ceremonial law. It was, in fact, an obligation, right? It was a moral law that you had to do. Instead of saying that what the Catholic Church says is that, I'm just going to read what I pulled up. Although the Church teaches that offering some form of material support to the Church is obligatory for all Catholic adults who are able to do so, sorry that I butchered that sentence, it does not specify what percentage of one's income should be given. Remember, tithing was an Old Testament obligation that was incumbent on the Jews under the law of Moses. Christians are dispensed from the obligation of tithing 10% of their incomes, but not from the obligation to help the church. Now, this is exactly what I understood from reading the Bible. It's like, well, obviously you need to give money to the church. You need to have a building where people can gather on a Sunday. Oh, we'll just do house churches, man. But even then, I mean, you're coming, let's say even if that was the case, okay, you go into somebody's house, you're using up their stuff. Should you not somehow compensate them for that, right? So yeah, I mean, no matter what, you need to give money to support the church, of course. And so I had a problem, and I'm like, how is it that people that have gone to like Bible college and have become pastors putting in years of work, sometimes like in one case I had pastor who had gone, he had a doctorate, right? He had a PhD. I don't know if that's the same thing. I think it is, but he had a PhD and he was preaching that tithing was obligatory. They're kind of like softly, yeah, well, I mean, basically it is, right? It's like that tithing 10% of your income. And then like the point I made last time, I'm like 10% of your income. What are you doing with 10% of people's income? That's a lot of money. 10% of people's income is a lot of money, right? You should be doing more than what the Protestant church is doing if you're taking 10% of people's money. I mean, you could at least build some nice churches, right? You could at least do that if you're going to. I mean, the government in the province I live in gives us free healthcare, free education, and pays for a large portion of the post-secondary education with 10% of people's income, right? And I mean, I guess we could get into some of the things on taxation, but we're not going to. So that's point one. Point two in this part is I stopped believing in Sola Scriptura. Now, I didn't stop believing in it in a like mental sense, or like if you ask me like, do you believe in Sola Scriptura? I'd be like, yeah, probably. But in like this was more an impression I had of what was going on. So maybe to say, I mean, I eventually stopped believing in Sola Scriptura, but earlier on, this was more of an impression than Sola Scriptura isn't correct because of this, and this. It was like, no, there's something wrong here. There's something wrong with, let's say, taking the Bible and giving it an outweighed sense of authority, or putting all forms of spiritual growth onto it. So yeah, there was, and again, Protestants would be like, well, it's not all the Bible. You have to go to church because it says, don't cease gathering together. So you have to go to church. You need to read the Bible and you need to pray. Which again, all of those things are good. You should be going to Mass weekly. But the reasons Catholics go to Mass weekly is much different than the reasons Protestants do, right? Much different. Their understanding of what's actually going on when you go to Mass is a lot different than the understanding of what Protestants believe is going on when they go to church, right? So yeah, thinking that, and I mean, like, we can just break this down, the issues with the Sola Scriptura, which is that we need more than Scripture in our lives to help us grow spiritually. We need much more than that. And thankfully, that has been provided. If you're a Catholic, you can't deny this because, there's Mass, there's, a bunch of things, the sacraments, everything like that, right? prayers. And so, whereas, the Christians, sorry, I've already recorded a 30-minute video and had to redo it. I'm now redoing it, so I'm a little bit like scatterbrained. The Protestants were giving the Bible this sense of power it was never meant to have. And to Protestants, me saying that is going to sound completely, heretical. But if you're a Catholic, you understand what I'm saying. If you think as a Christian just reading the Bible, praying, and going to church is going to be enough, you've got it wrong, right? Especially if you're saying that the Bible is the, this thing that's so powerful, it can just completely transform you in every way. I mean, it can do that, by the way, but not in the way Protestants talk about. It was never meant to do that, right? That's the issue. It's not that the Bible doesn't have authority. Of course it has authority. It's the Bible's infallible, right? You have to believe that. Sacred scripture is infallible. It just does not have the amount of life-changing attributes that Protestants say it does. And if you're Catholic, you have to agree with me, because if what Protestants said about the Bible was true in its life-changing attributes, we wouldn't need Catholicism, right? And so I came to understand that this view of the Bible was kind of absurd and just not true. I came to start getting this impression because, again, just observe it, right? Go read the Bible every day. It's going to do you good, of course. But it's not going to do you as well as other things. And not as well as they like to make it out to be. I'm like, I don't know if these people are just faking it or whatever. But, fake it till you make it type thing. But I'm like, that just was not happening for me. And the other thing I kind of understood, this is probably much later on in the process, is that most people aren't smart enough to really understand the Bible. And again, I know maybe people watch this and think I'm full of myself, but I'm like, if you don't understand what I'm saying here, people's reading comprehension is actually astoundingly low in my view, right? And if you doubt me, just go have an argument with somebody over Facebook comments and see if they have an ability to read what you said and repeat it back to you. And people really do not have as much reading comprehension as they would need in general, right? If such a large portion of the population has not enough reading comprehension and or intelligence to make the proper conclusions from the Bible, well, I mean, how's it going to make sense that these people are going to get the same thing out of reading the Bible that some theologian who has the understanding and whatever is going to get out of it, right? They're not, because they don't actually understand what it's saying. I mean, you need to understand what it's saying in order to get that out of it. And you could say, well, maybe that's my problem. And again, I know high church Protestants would just be like, yeah, that's because these low church evangelicals are just grug-brained morons. I know I'm not saying about that about them, but I know that's what the high church Protestants would say, is that it's like, well, no, that's not what Sola Scriptura ever meant. And I'm like, well, if that's not what it ever meant, how come that's the current expression of it, right? I know it's not what it was supposed to originally mean, but that's what it has become. That's the expression. That's what it devolved into, right? The reason we have people believing this about the Bible is because of something that happened hundreds of years ago, a belief that was pushed forward hundreds of years ago, and people saying, well, where's that in the Bible? And then getting rid of all of these beautiful traditions and beautiful sacraments through which we were receiving grace, beautiful traditions of praying prayers that weren't in our own words, but were in the words of others. They got rid of that because of Sola Scriptura. So then when you get rid of all of these things and you have just Sola Scriptura left over, and you're like, well, I mean, the Bible is the end-all be-all for the Christian life. And that's not the case. And so, and again, there's just going to be so many different sects of Protestants that have different issues with this argument, because they're like, well, no, you also need the Holy Spirit, or, oh, well, you also need to speak in tongues or whatever, right? There's just so many different sects of Protestantism that say completely different things about how the Christian life is supposed to look, that it almost becomes impossible to make any sort of generalization. So if it doesn't apply, let it fly, right? And again, what I just said is one of the greatest arguments for why Protestantism is just a lie, right? If you have that many different sects saying completely different things, that's kind of a clue that perhaps they're all wrong. You know what I mean? They're all wrong. That's bad. That is just the wide amount of different conclusions and beliefs. It's absurd. Sorry, I'm getting off topic there, but yeah. So, and then I'm going to quickly go into this point, and this is on Sola Scriptura. Later on, very kind of late on in this process, I heard an Orthodox priest tell I think it was a Lutheran YouTuber, what he thought of the Bible, because the Lutheran YouTuber asked him, and the Orthodox priest said, well, it's our book. We can do with it what we want. And I heard him say that, and I was like, yeah, it is their book. How did I never come to this conclusion before? Because I know history, right? I knew that the Bible was canonized by the church. So I'm like, so then that led me to the conclusion, a very logical conclusion, that you can't deny the authority of the church without denying the authority of the Bible, right? So the Bible was canonized by the Catholics and the Orthodox when they were still one church. So for Protestants to say Sola Scriptura and break off and start their own church, I mean, that's like saying, well, no, we believe in the tradition of our spiritual ancestors when it comes to the Bible, but every other tradition, no way, right? I mean, that's a problem. So, they had the only authority the church had was in making the Bible, putting together the Bible, listing the Bible, and then except for the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, right? And the other books, I can't name them off the top of my head, but the 1st and 2nd Maccabees, they were wrong in doing that, but they were right to canonize the Bible. They had the authority to canonize the Bible, but they don't have the authority to do anything else or tell me what to believe in anything else. It's like, come on, that's absurd, right? I used to believe that, so I'm making as much fun of myself as whatever. Okay, so 2 more points here to go. This last point, actually the last 2 points are kind of together. One leads into the other. The last reason I left the church, the Protestant church, to become Catholic is because I started looking around me, seeing that Western civilization was in free fall, and that caused me to stop believing in libertarian-esque ideals, quasi-libertarian ideals such as live and let live, well, I mean, if it's not hurting anyone, what's the big issue? Those sort of ideals, I realized that was going to be very bad for people, and that Christians needed to come together as one church, needed to be unified into one church, perhaps a universal kind of church, and being unified, then grab political power and put the Satanists in check, right? That's what I started to understand about what was going on around me. It's like, we're in free fall here. The world we're leaving for our children is going to suck. And I want to leave a good inheritance for my children. You know, I don't want them to grow up in a world that's filled with degeneracy and completely absurd, what we call clown world. I don't want them to grow up in clown world. You know, I want them to grow up with a sense of understanding that truth exists and, you know, beauty exists, and are able to differentiate between beauty and ugliness and, you know, everything like that. And I'm like, they're not going to get this unless either some crazy miracle happens. Well, probably we need a crazy miracle to happen, you know, some sort of divine intervention. But they're also not going to get this if the Christian church doesn't get its act together and force non-Christians in Western civilization to smarten up. And you have to believe this, right? At some point, you just look around and you're like, well, I mean, they want to force me to do all of these things. So if it's a question of force, well, let's just force them to do the right things, you know, like not look at pornography. We could just, I mean, every Christian should be for banning pornography, right? And once I stopped believing that, once I realized that this idea that it's like, well, live and let live, you know, as long as it's not hurting anyone, we don't need to make it illegal. Once I realized that that position was absurd and was just going to cause, well, because if that's true, think about that. If that's true, I mean, what's the purpose of having a government, right? I mean, that gets rid of the entire philosophy of government. Now, libertarians would say, exactly, we don't need a government. Unfortunately, I had already gone through the libertarian phase, realized it was a bunch of bullshit. BS. It was a bunch of BS, which it is, right? And that's easy to tell. Just look at history. This is, again, I was a libertarian until one day I thought, wait a minute, if governments don't need to exist, if there's no reason to have governments around, how come all throughout human history there's always been some form of non-voluntary government? Right? I was like, voluntarism isn't real because it's never existed, right? So it's like when it completely denies human nature, that ideology is bullshit. So, you know, that's why we need to have governments. Okay, so establishing that, then we should understand that governments are supposed to do a little bit more than just keep people from fighting each other, right? And we can go back, look at, let's say, what, who was it, Plato? I can't remember which philosopher it was. It was a Greek philosopher saying that, you know, the point of having laws is to instruct the citizen in proper living, right? So yeah, you need to have laws that dictate people's behavior to a certain extent. You know, you can't look at pornography, duh. You can't smoke weed or do drugs, duh. And everyone's arguments, oh, people are going to do it anyway. Like maybe the drug addicts will do it anyway. That's whatever. That is what it is. The drug addicts and the sex addicts will do it anyway, but everyone else won't. And once you take away the legality of it, once there's consequences, people actually stop. And so, again, realizing that if we didn't start doing this and start forcing some of these issues, stop playing nice with people who had no interest in playing nice with us, who only hated us, stop playing nice with them, and instead of trying to be like, oh, you know, flies attract honey sort of thing, realizing that actually, no, people are attracted. The thing about ungodly people, they're more attracted to power than anything, right? People who lack virtue are more interested in power than anything. So to think that it's like, the way in which our virtue converts people is because we're providing grace. They're receiving grace. That's the way in which people are converting. It's not because they're having an emotional experience of, oh, that was so nice. That's not why they convert, because of charity. They convert because of charity, because they've received grace from God. That's why they're converting. It has nothing to do with their emotions. In fact, the emotions of the heathens are what's causing this problem. Okay, so with all that said, I started then to think of what the ideal church might look like that could deal with that problem. Universal, all together, had the ability to just kick people out for spouting off heresy. If anyone goes against this, let them be anathema. So they'd have a list of beliefs. They would exist as a unified church that could dominate other churches. They would need to do this. So yeah, I started thinking, hey, we need a new Christian tradition and a new Christian church that does all of these things. I don't know why it didn't right away occur to me that, oh yeah, the Catholic Church does all of that. I think it's because I thought the Catholic Church was in error in a lot of their teachings, which I later came to find out was untrue. But then I was thinking about this, and I'm like, but this is going to be a problem. Let's say we can make all of this happen. We can get this church set up and everything like that. I'm like, there's a fundamental flaw in this idea, which is that we're trying to make tradition 2,000 years into Christianity. We're trying to make a Christian, not just like a new Christian tradition, like, the rosary didn't come about until, I can't even remember. I want to say it was like 1,000 years, I don't know. But, the rosary wasn't there for a while, right? That was at one time a new tradition. That didn't mean it was a bad tradition. It was just new. So there's nothing wrong with bringing in new traditions. I'm saying, but the thing I was thinking of, I want to use Christianity to enforce traditionality, but the only way that I was thinking of doing that is by having a new form of Christianity, 2,000 years after the fact. And I'm like, how in the world is that going to enforce traditionality? It's broken. It's fundamentally flawed in its conception. Well, later on, I'm like, oh, duh, Catholic Church, there we go, right? But, the reason I wanted to do that with a new church was because, like I said, my view of the Catholic Church was that they were in error, when in fact I was the one in error, right? But once I came to all of these conclusions, let's just say about society, that a church akin to the Catholic Church was the only thing going to fix it, because it was the only thing that could bring tradition in. And that, Protestantism, that idea of Protestantism just started to really, really start to erode. And so, yeah, that's the last point I have here. And just a quick summarization is this video I talked about tithing being a reason that my belief in Protestantism started to collapse. The Sola Scriptura was another thing that I talked about, and how I started seeing flaws in it, and then that caused a collapse in my beliefs. And then I stopped being a liberal, basically. And I stopped believing in liberalism and humanism. And that also, because of that, I started looking for solutions to liberalism and humanism. And I came up with the conception of a church that was actually the Catholic Church, right? Or something akin to the Catholic Church in its structure and hierarchy, right? So yeah, that is the end of this video. God bless. Hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.